The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Samuel Mitchell's weathered face as he rode across his dying ranch. It was July 1887, and everything around him told the same sad story. Cracked earth stretched as far as he could see. His cattle, once numbering in the hundreds, had dwindled to barely 50 head. The drought had been going on for 3 years now, and it was killing everything. Samuel pulled his hat lower over his eyes and urged his horse toward Canyon Creek. At 35, he looked older than his years. Deep lines carved his face from squinting against the desert sun, and his hands were rough as leather from years of hard work. He had built this ranch from nothing, but now it seemed like nothing was all he had left. The neighboring ranches stood empty now. The Hendersons had packed up last spring after Apache raids took their prize horses. The Murphy family left in June when their well went dry. Samuel was stubborn, maybe too stubborn, but this land was all he knew. His wife had died of fever 5 years back, and he had no children to worry about. If the ranch died, he figured he might as well die with it. As he neared the creek, Samuel noticed something strange. His old barn door was slightly open, though he remembered closing it tight the night before. The building sat about a quarter-mile from his house, used mostly for storing hay and tools. These days, with so few cattle left, it was mostly empty. Samuel dismounted quietly and tied his horse to a fence post. The desert had taught him to be careful. Apache bands still roamed these parts, and a man alone was an easy target. He pulled his rifle from its saddle holster and approached the barn slowly. The wooden door creaked as he pushed it open. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the old boards, creating long shadows across the dirt floor. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then movement in the far corner caught his eye. 3 women sat huddled together on a pile of old horse blankets. They were Apache. That much was clear from their clothing and long black hair. But these weren't ordinary Apache women. They were tall, much taller than any native women Samuel had ever seen. The youngest looked to be maybe 18, and she stood nearly as tall as Samuel himself. The other 2 were older and even taller. The women had heard him enter. They sat perfectly still, watching him with dark, alert eyes. None of them showed fear, which surprised Samuel. Most people, Apache or white, would have been nervous facing a man with a rifle. These 3 just waited to see what he would do. Samuel lowered his weapon slowly. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, though he doubted they understood English. The oldest woman spoke in Apache, probably warning her sisters to be ready to run. But they didn't move. Samuel noticed they looked exhausted. Their clothes were torn and dusty, and they had the hollow look of people who hadn't eaten in days. Water. That's what they needed most in this heat. Samuel stepped back and gestured toward the creek. "Water," he said, pointing. "Agua." He remembered that word from his dealings with Mexican traders. The youngest woman tilted her head, studying him. She said something to her sisters in their own language. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but her tone seemed less hostile than curious. Samuel made a decision that would change his life forever. He set his rifle against the barn wall and walked to his saddlebags. He pulled out his water bottle and a cloth bag containing jerky and hardtack biscuits. It wasn't much, but it was all he had with him. He placed the food and water on the ground halfway between himself and the women, then stepped back. "For you," he said simply. The 3 women exchanged glances. The middle sister, who seemed to be the peacemaker, spoke softly to the others. After a moment, she stood and walked forward. She was graceful despite her unusual height, moving with the quiet confidence Samuel had seen in Apache warriors. She picked up the water bottle and drank carefully, not greedily, though Samuel could see she was desperately thirsty. She passed it to her sisters, who also drank sparingly. Then she opened the food bag and divided the contents equally among the 3 of them. "Thank you," she said in careful English, surprising Samuel. Her accent was thick, but the words were clear. Samuel nodded. "You speak English?" "Little bit," she replied. "Mission school." "Long time ago?" The woman gestured to herself. "Chenoa," then she pointed to her sisters. "Ayana Kimimela," Samuel touched his chest. "Samuel." They ate in silence while Samuel tried to figure out what to do. 3 Apache women hiding in his barn created all kinds of problems. If the cavalry found them here, he could be accused of harboring fugitives. If other Apache bands found them, they might think he had captured them. Either way, trouble would follow. But looking at these women, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in years. His ranch had been so lonely since his wife died. The silence sometimes drove him near crazy. These three strangers had brought something alive back into his world, even if he couldn't name what it was. The sun was getting lower, painting the barn walls orange and red. Samuel knew he needed to make a decision soon. He could ask them to leave, which would probably mean their death in the desert. He could take them to the nearest army post, which would mean the reservation and separation from each other. Or he could do something crazy. "You can stay," he heard himself saying. "Tonight, in the barn, safe," Chenua translated for her sisters. Ayana, the eldest, spoke sharply. She didn't trust this offer from a white man, and Samuel couldn't blame her. Kimimela, the youngest, seemed more interested. She kept glancing at Samuel with bright, curious eyes. "We go tomorrow," Chenua said finally. Samuel nodded. Tomorrow. But as he walked back to his house that evening, Samuel wondered if tomorrow would really come. These three mysterious women had appeared in his life like something from a dream. He had a feeling that by tomorrow everything would be different. He was right about that. He just had no idea how different things were about to become. The desert wind picked up as darkness fell, carrying with it the sound of approaching horses. Samuel counted at least a dozen riders moving toward his ranch. Apache riders, and they were coming fast. Samuel grabbed his rifle and stepped onto his porch, his heart pounding. The three women in his barn had brought visitors, and something told him this meeting would change everything. The Apache riders appeared like shadows against the desert twilight. Samuel counted 12 warriors, their horses moving with deadly silence across the hard-packed earth. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his rifle, though he knew it would be useless against so many skilled fighters. The riders formed a semicircle around Samuel's house, close enough that he could see their painted faces in the fading light. Their leader rode forward alone, and Samuel felt his breath catch in his throat. This was no ordinary Apache warrior. The man sat tall and proud on a magnificent spotted horse. His hair was streaked with silver, and deep lines marked his weathered face. He wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with items clearly taken from the white world. A cavalry officer's belt, a silver watch chain, boots that had once belonged to a rancher. This was a chief, and a powerful one. Samuel had heard stories about Chief Nalnish from other ranchers before they fled. The Apache leader was said to be cunning and fierce, a man who had never been captured by the cavalry despite years of pursuit. Some said he was a ghost who could disappear into the desert air. Looking at him now, Samuel could believe those stories. The chief raised his hand and his warriors stopped moving. The desert fell silent except for the soft snorting of horses and the whisper of wind through the sagebrush. Samuel forced himself to stand still on his porch, though every instinct told him to run. "You are Samuel Mitchell," the chief said in clear English. His voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed without question. Samuel nodded, not trusting his voice to stay steady. "You have my daughters." It wasn't a question, and Samuel realized there was no point in lying. "Yes, they're safe." Chief Nalnish studied Samuel for a long moment. "You gave them food, water. They needed help. Many white men would have shot them, or taken them to the soldiers." Samuel shrugged. "I'm not many white men." Something that might have been approval flickered in the chief's dark eyes. He dismounted and walked closer to the porch, his warriors remaining motionless on their horses. Samuel noticed the chief moved with a slight limp, probably from an old battle wound. "My daughters are not like other Apache women," the chief said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "They are too tall, too strange. Their mother died bringing sickness to our band. Some say they carry bad medicine." Samuel frowned. "That's foolish talk." "Yes, but talk can kill as surely as bullets." The chief's expression grew sad. "No Apache man will take them as wives. They will grow old alone with no children, no place in the tribe. When I die, they will have nothing." Samuel began to understand why the three women had been wandering alone in the desert. They were outcasts from their own people, carrying the burden of their mother's death and their unusual appearance. "I am sorry for your loss," Samuel said carefully. "Your wife, she was a good woman, a healing woman. But the fever took her, and ignorant people blamed my daughters." The chief's voice hardened. "I have seen enough of ignorance, from Apache and from white men both." The chief stepped onto the porch and Samuel tensed, but the Apache leader made no threatening moves. Instead, he studied Samuel's face in the dim light. "You live alone. No wife, no children." Samuel nodded. "My wife died 5 years ago. You work hard." This ranch, it was nothing when you came. Now it feeds cattle, grows crops. You know how to build something from dust." Samuel wondered where this conversation was leading. The chief seemed to know a lot about him, which meant Apache scouts had been watching his ranch for some time. "I have a proposition for you. Samuel Mitchell." The chief's voice became formal, as if he were conducting important tribal business. "You will marry my daughters. All three of them." Samuel's jaw dropped. "What?" "You will take them as your wives. You will protect them, provide for them, treat them with honor. In return, they will bring you strength, wisdom, children. They will help you build your ranch into something great." Samuel stared at the chief in disbelief. "I can't marry 3 women. It's not legal." "Legal?" The chief laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What is legal about taking Apache children from their families and putting them in reservation schools? What is legal about killing buffalo to starve my people? White man's law serves white men. My law serves my daughters." Samuel shook his head. "Even if I wanted to, your daughters might not agree. They don't know me. They have their own feelings about this. They will agree because I command it, and because they are smart enough to see that you are a good man." The chief stepped closer. "I am old, Samuel Mitchell. I have fought the cavalry for 30 years, but I cannot fight time. Soon there will be a final battle, and I will not survive it. My daughters need a protector who can live in both worlds, Apache and white. But 3 wives, how would that even work?" "You will learn. They will teach you. Apache men sometimes took multiple wives when it served the tribe. This serves my daughters, which serves me." Samuel's mind raced. The proposal was impossible, insane, and completely outside anything he had ever imagined. Yet looking at this proud chief, he sensed the desperation beneath the commanding words. This was a father trying to save his children in the only way he could think of. "They're in the barn," Samuel said finally. "Don't you want to speak with them first?" Chief Nalnish shook his head. "I spoke with them this morning before they came here. I told them to find the white rancher who lives alone by Canyon Creek. I told them to see if he was worthy of my trust." Samuel realized he had been tested without knowing it. The 3 women hadn't stumbled onto his ranch by accident. They had been sent to evaluate him, and, Samuel asked, "Chenoa says you shared your food without asking for anything in return. Ayana says you lowered your weapon when you could have kept them helpless. Kimimela says you have kind eyes." The chief smiled for the first time. "My daughters do not give praise easily." Samuel looked toward the barn where he could see the faint glow of a small fire through the cracks in the walls. 3 remarkable women were waiting there, not knowing their fate was being decided by their father and a stranger. "I need time to think about this," Samuel said. Chief Nalnish shook his head. "There is no time. The cavalry will come looking for my band within days. When they do, my daughters must be under your protection or they will be taken to the reservation." He fixed Samuel with a fierce stare. "You will marry them. You will care for them. This is not a request." Before Samuel could respond, the chief turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted in one fluid motion despite his limp. "I will return in 1 moon to see how you honor my command," the chief said. "If I find my daughters unhappy or mistreated, you will answer to me." The chief raised his hand and his warriors wheeled their horses around. Within moments they had vanished into the darkness as suddenly as they had appeared. Samuel stood alone on his porch, staring at the empty desert. The encounter felt like a strange dream, but the chief's words echoed in his mind. "You will marry them." He looked toward the barn again, where 3 women waited for him to decide their future. Samuel had always thought his life was complicated when he was just fighting drought and loneliness. Now he faced a choice that would either destroy him or transform him completely. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Change was coming to Samuel Mitchell's ranch, whether he was ready for it or not. The morning after Chief Nalnish's visit, Samuel woke before dawn with a knot in his stomach. For a moment he hoped the previous night had been a strange dream. Then he looked toward the barn and saw thin smoke rising from a carefully concealed fire. The 3 Apache women were still there, and he was still bound by their father's impossible command. Samuel made coffee and sat on his porch, trying to figure out what to do next. How did a man approach 3 women he was supposedly going to marry? He had courted his late wife for 6 months before proposing, and that had been terrifying enough. This situation was beyond anything he could have imagined. After an hour of sitting and worrying, Samuel decided to start with something simple. He gathered eggs from his chickens, picked vegetables from his small garden, and walked toward the barn. If nothing else, he could make sure the women had a good breakfast. He knocked on the barn door, feeling foolish. "It's Samuel," he called. Chenoa opened the door cautiously. She had braided her long hair and cleaned the dust from her clothes. Even in the morning light, her unusual height was striking. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, with the graceful bearing of someone comfortable with her own strength. "Good morning," she said in her careful English. "I brought food," Samuel said, holding up the basket. "Thought you might be hungry." Chenoa smiled for the first time since he had met her. "Thank you. We are hungry." She stepped aside to let him enter the barn. Samuel was surprised by what he saw. The women had transformed the empty space into something resembling a home. They had swept the dirt floor clean and arranged their few belongings with care. Ayana was tending the small fire they used for cooking, while Kimimela was braiding rope from dried grass. Ayana looked up when Samuel entered, and he felt the force of her suspicious gaze. She was the tallest of the three, probably 6 feet 2 inches, with the bearing of a warrior. Her dark eyes missed nothing as she studied Samuel's face and posture. When she spoke to her sisters in Apache, her tone was clearly skeptical. Kimimela, the youngest, was more welcoming. She jumped up from her rope-making and approached Samuel with open curiosity. At 18, she was already as tall as most men, but she moved with the energy and enthusiasm of someone who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of the world. "You make good house," she said in broken English. Gesturing around the barn, Samuel set the food basket down near their fire. "It's not much of a house for 3 ladies." Chenoa translated his words, and Ayana responded with what sounded like sharp criticism. Chenoa looked embarrassed as she translated back. "Ayana says this is better than the reservation. She says white men's houses are traps for Apache women." Samuel nodded slowly. "She's probably right to be careful. I've heard bad stories about the reservations." This seemed to surprise Ayana. She asked Chenoa something, and after the translation, she studied Samuel with slightly less hostility. Over breakfast, Samuel learned more about the 3 sisters. Chenoa had indeed attended a mission school as a child, which explained her English. She had learned to read and write, skills that made her valuable to Apache trading parties. Ayana had trained as a warrior alongside the men of their band, something unusual but not unheard of among the Apache. Kimimela was known for her skill with horses and her ability to find water in the desert. As the days passed, an awkward routine developed. Samuel would bring food and supplies to the barn each morning and evening. The women would accept his offerings politely but kept their distance. They divided the barn into 3 sections, each sister creating her own private space. Samuel wondered if they were waiting for him to choose one of them, or if they expected him to announce wedding plans. The situation became more complicated when Samuel's nearest neighbor, old Pete Hendricks, rode over to check on him. Pete was one of the few ranchers who hadn't fled the area, partly because he was too stubborn to leave and partly because he was too poor to start over somewhere else. "Saw smoke coming from your barn yesterday," Pete said, dismounting near Samuel's house. "Thought you might have trouble." Samuel felt sweat break out on his forehead. "Just burning some old trash." Pete squinted toward the barn. "Awful lot of smoke for trash, and I could swear I saw someone moving around over there." Before Samuel could answer, Kimimela appeared around the corner of the barn, carrying a bucket toward the creek. She moved with her characteristic grace, and even at a distance, her unusual height was obvious. Pete's jaw dropped. "Samuel, is that an Apache woman?" "It's complicated, Pete." "Complicated?" Pete's voice rose. "You got Apache women living on your ranch? Are you out of your mind? What if the cavalry finds out? What if other Apache think you captured them?" Samuel had been worrying about the same things. They needed help. I couldn't just turn them away. Help is one thing, but letting them stay? Pete shook his head. "This is dangerous, Samuel. For you, and for them." That evening, Samuel decided he needed to talk to the sisters about their situation. He found them sitting around their small fire, speaking quietly in Apache. When he approached, their conversation stopped. "We need to discuss what happens next," Samuel said. Chenoa translated, and all 3 women looked at him expectantly. "People are starting to notice you're here. My neighbor saw Kimimela today. Soon others will know." Ayana spoke rapidly in Apache, her tone urgent. Chenoa nodded and turned to Samuel. "Ayana says we should leave before we bring trouble to you. Where would you go?" The sisters exchanged glances. Mexico, maybe, Chenoa said. Find other Apache bands who fled there. Samuel thought about the dangers of such a journey. That's hundreds of miles through desert and hostile territory. We are Apache, Kimimela said proudly in her limited English. We know desert. Samuel looked at the three remarkable women and felt something twist in his chest. Over the past weeks, his empty ranch had felt alive again. Hearing their voices, seeing their small fire in the evenings, knowing he wasn't completely alone. It had mattered more than he wanted to admit. Your father said I should marry you, Samuel said finally. Ayana's eyes flashed with anger, and she spoke sharply to her sisters. Chenoa looked uncomfortable as she translated. Ayana says no white man commands Apache women, not even our father. Samuel raised his hands peacefully. I'm not commanding anything. I'm just saying, maybe we could find a way to make this work. You need a safe place to live. He paused, not sure how to finish. You need what? Chenoa asked gently. I need people who care whether I live or die, Samuel said honestly. This ranch is killing me with loneliness. Kimimela spoke to her sisters in Apache, her voice soft but insistent. Whatever she said made Ayana look thoughtful and Chenoa nod slowly. Kimimela says you have a good heart, Chenoa translated. She says maybe we could try to live together as friends, not as husband and wives. Samuel felt relief wash over him. Friend sounds good. Ayana asked a question and Chenoa translated. What about the white man's law? What about other people who will not understand? Samuel had been thinking about the same problems. We'll figure it out as we go. Maybe people will accept it if they see it's working. As the fire burned low, the four of them sat in comfortable silence. Samuel felt like they had crossed some kind of bridge, though he wasn't sure where it led. The chief's command still hung over them. But at least now they were facing the future together instead of as strangers. Looking at the three sisters in the firelight, Samuel realized his life had already changed forever. The question now was whether they could build something good from such an impossible beginning. August brought the worst flash flood anyone could remember. The warnings came in the form of distant thunder rolling across the desert, though no rain had fallen for weeks. Samuel woke before dawn to find his horses restless and his cattle lowing nervously in their pen. Ayana appeared at his kitchen door as he was drinking his morning coffee. She rarely approached the house, preferring to keep her distance, so her presence immediately told him something was wrong. Water comes, she said in halting English, pointing toward the mountains. Big water. Soon. Samuel stepped outside and looked toward Canyon Creek. The usually dry creek bed showed no signs of water, but Ayana's worried expression convinced him to take her warning seriously. Apache people knew the desert better than anyone. How much time do we have? He asked. Ayana held up 5 fingers, then closed her fist twice. 10 minutes? 10 hours? Samuel decided not to take chances. We need to move the cattle to higher ground, he said. Ayana nodded and ran toward the barn, calling to her sisters in rapid Apache. Within minutes, all 3 women emerged, moving with the quick efficiency of people who understood emergency. Samuel saddled his horse while the sisters prepared their own mounts. They had been training several of his horses over the past weeks, though Samuel hadn't realized how skilled they were until now. Ayana rode bareback with the confidence of someone who had grown up on horseback. Chenoa and Kimimela quickly fashioned bridles from rope and mounted as well. The work of moving 50 head of cattle should have taken most of the day with just Samuel working alone. With 4 riders, they accomplished it in 2 hours. The sisters seemed to know exactly what each cow would do before it happened, guiding the herd with whistles and calls that Samuel had never heard before. As they drove the last of the cattle onto a rocky ridge above the ranch, Samuel heard it, a distant roar like an approaching train. He looked back toward Canyon Creek and saw a wall of brown water racing toward his ranch buildings. Get to the house, he shouted. They rode hard, reaching Samuel's porch just as the first surge of floodwater swept past the barn. The water rose with terrifying speed, turning the usually peaceful creek into a raging river that spread across the entire valley floor. For 3 days, they were trapped in Samuel's house while the flood raged outside. The water never quite reached the house itself, which sat on slightly higher ground, but it surrounded them completely. The barn, which had been the sisters' home, disappeared under brown water on the first day. Being confined together in the small house broke down the last barriers between them. Samuel shared his food supplies, and the women contributed items they had managed to grab before fleeing the barn. Chenoa had saved her collection of healing herbs, Ayana had her weapons and tools, and Kimimela had rescued her rope-making materials. On the first night, as rain pounded the roof and wind howled around the house, they sat around Samuel's fireplace and shared stories. Chenoa told about learning to read at the mission school, where Apache children were forbidden to speak their own language. Ayana described training with Apache warriors, learning to track and hunt and fight. Kimimela spoke of her special connection with horses, how she could calm any animal just by singing to it. Samuel found himself telling them about his late wife, how they had built the ranch together from nothing, and how lost he had felt since her death. He had never spoken about these feelings to anyone before, but something about the storm and the intimacy of their shared shelter made the words come easily. On the second day, they discovered that several of Samuel's cattle had been injured when the flood first hit. Chenoa immediately took charge, using her knowledge of desert plants to create healing poultices for cuts and sprains. She worked with quiet confidence, and Samuel realized she was probably as skilled as any doctor he had ever met. Ayana proved equally valuable when they spotted Apache raiders on the ridge across the flooded valley. The men were clearly hoping to steal cattle once the water receded, but they abandoned their plans when they saw Ayana standing on Samuel's porch with her rifle ready. She called out to them in Apache, and after a brief conversation they rode away. "What did you tell them?" Samuel asked. "I told them you are under our protection," Ayana said simply. Samuel felt something warm spread through his chest at those words. For the first time since his wife's death, he felt like he belonged to a family again. Kimimela's contribution came on the third day, when the floodwaters finally began to recede. Samuel had been worried about getting to his cattle, many of which were stranded on small islands in the flooded valley. Kimimela studied the situation, then fashioned a series of ropes and pulleys that allowed them to reach the animals safely. "Where did you learn to do that?" Samuel asked, watching her work. "Apache women must be clever," she said with a grin. "Men fight. Women solve problems." As they worked together to save the cattle and assess the damage to the ranch, Samuel began to understand what Chief Nalnish had meant about his daughters bringing strength. Each sister had skills that complemented his own, and together they could accomplish things that would have been impossible alone. The flood had destroyed the barn and damaged several other buildings, but it had also brought something unexpected. Working side by side through the crisis, the four of them had become a team. Samuel no longer thought of the sisters as guests or refugees. They had proven themselves as partners in the truest sense. On the evening after the floodwaters receded, they sat on Samuel's porch and watched the sun set over their muddy but intact ranch. Samuel realized that for the first time in months he wasn't worried about the future. Whatever challenges came next, he wouldn't face them alone. "We rebuild," Ayana said, surprising Samuel with her use of English. "Together," Chenoa added. Kimimela nodded enthusiastically. "Make ranch strong." Samuel looked at the three remarkable women who had become his partners in survival. Chief Nalnish had commanded him to marry his daughters, but something deeper than marriage had developed between them. They had become family in the way that mattered most, people who would stand together when everything else fell apart. The flood had taken his barn and scattered his cattle, but it had given him something more valuable than he had ever hoped to find. As the stars came out over the desert, Samuel felt truly at home for the first time since his wife's death. Tomorrow they would start rebuilding, and they would do it together. September brought cooler mornings and the hard work of rebuilding after the flood. Samuel and the three sisters worked from sunrise to sunset, raising a new barn and repairing damaged fences. As they labored side by side, something deeper than friendship began to grow between them. Samuel found himself watching Ayana as she worked with the horses. Her movements were sure and graceful, and she had an almost magical ability to calm even the most nervous animals. When a stallion that had been spooked by the flood refused to let anyone near him, Ayana spent 3 days sitting quietly in his pen, speaking to him in soft Apache until he finally approached her. "You have great patience," Samuel told her one evening as they watched the horse nuzzle her shoulder. Ayana looked surprised by the compliment. "Patience is survival," she said in her improving English. "In desert, in war, in life. Rush and you die." Their conversations began to last longer each day. Samuel learned that Ayana had wanted to be a war leader like some of the legendary Apache women, but her unusual height, had made some warriors uncomfortable. She was too different, too challenging to traditional ways. I understand feeling like an outsider, Samuel said. When I first came here, other ranchers thought I was crazy for trying to build in such hard country. You proved them wrong, Ayanna said, gesturing at the ranch around them. So will you. Something shifted in Ayanna's dark eyes when he said that, and Samuel felt his heart beat faster. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was strong in ways that called to something deep in his soul. With Chenoa, the connection developed differently. She became his closest confidant, the person he turned to when problems seemed overwhelming. Her wisdom amazed him. She understood not just the practical matters of desert survival, but the deeper currents of human nature. When Samuel worried about what would happen when Chief Nalnish returned to check on his daughters, Chenoa was the one who helped him think through the complications. "My father gave you an impossible command," she said one evening as they walked along the creek. "But maybe impossible things sometimes become possible when people care enough to make them work." "What do you mean?" Chenoa was quiet for a long moment. "I mean that caring for someone changes the rules. When you care, you find ways to make impossible things possible." Samuel stopped walking and looked at her. "Do you care?" "About me, I mean?" Chenoa's smile was gentle but unmistakable. "Yes, Samuel. I care very much." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Samuel had been a faithful husband to his late wife, and the idea of loving someone new still felt like betrayal. But Chenoa's presence in his life had become essential in ways he couldn't deny. Kimimela's affection showed itself differently. She was playful and teasing, finding ways to make Samuel laugh when the work got too hard or the problem seemed too big. Her joy was infectious, and her curiosity about everything in Samuel's world kept surprising him. She asked endless questions about white customs, about the books in his house, about the strange tools he used for ranching. In return, she taught him Apache songs and showed him how to read weather signs in the sky. "You're like a teacher," Samuel told her one afternoon as she demonstrated how to weave grass into rope strong enough to hold cattle. "You're like a student," she replied with a grin. "Very slow student, but you try hard." Samuel found himself looking forward to her teasing, to the way her eyes lit up when she learned something new. At 18, Kimimela had a spirit that reminded him of the young man he had once been, full of dreams and energy. The problem was that Samuel's feelings for all three women were growing stronger each day, but in different ways. With Ayanna, he felt the deep attraction of two strong people recognizing each other as equals. With Chenoa, he felt the comfort of perfect understanding and shared wisdom. With Kimimela, he felt the joy of someone who brought light into every dark moment. The situation became more complicated when a traveling preacher named Reverend Williams arrived at the ranch in early October. The elderly minister was making his rounds through the scattered settlements, offering to perform marriages and baptisms for anyone who needed them. "Haven't seen you at services lately." "Brother Mitchell," the Reverend said over dinner. "Too busy with ranch work, I suppose." Samuel glanced at the three sisters who were serving the meal with quiet efficiency. The Reverend had clearly noticed them but was too polite to ask direct questions about why three Apache women were living on Samuel's ranch. "These are my housekeepers," Samuel said awkwardly. "They help with the work." The Reverend nodded, but Samuel could see him trying to figure out the unusual arrangement. After dinner, the sisters retreated to the new barn, leaving Samuel alone with his guest. "Interesting housekeepers," Reverend Williams said carefully. "Quite tall, aren't they?" "They're good workers," Samuel replied. "I'm sure they are. But brother, you need to be careful about appearances. People talk, and having three unmarried women living on your ranch, well, it could cause problems." Samuel felt his face grow hot. "Nothing improper is happening here. I believe you. But belief and appearance are different things. Have you considered marriage?" "To one of them, I mean." The suggestion hit Samuel like a physical blow. Marriage to one sister would mean losing the others, and he couldn't bear the thought of any of them leaving. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He walked out to the barn and found the sisters sitting around their small fire, talking quietly in Apache. They looked up when he approached, and he could see concern in their faces. "The preacher thinks I should marry one of you," Samuel said bluntly. Chenoa translated for her sisters, and all three looked troubled. Ayanna spoke first, her voice sharp with emotion. "She says white man's marriage is a cage," Chenoa translated. She says if you choose one, the others become nothing. Kimimela added something, her young face serious for once. Kimimela says we are sisters. We stay together or we all leave together. Samuel felt something break inside his chest. I don't want any of you to leave. Then what do you want? Chenoa asked gently. Samuel looked at the three women who had become the center of his world. I want all of you to stay. I want us to be a family, whatever that means. I want... He paused, afraid to say the words aloud. What? Ayana asked in English. I want to love all of you, Samuel said finally, in whatever way makes sense. I know it's not normal. I know it's not legal, but it's what I feel. The sisters exchanged long looks, communicating in the wordless way that families develop over time. Finally, Chenoa spoke. Apache men sometimes had more than one wife when it served the tribe. White men say this is wrong, but white men say many things that serve only white men. Ayana nodded slowly. We choose our own path. Kimimela smiled, her joy breaking through the serious mood. We choose you. You choose us, simple. Samuel felt tears sting his eyes. But how do we make it work? The law, the church, other people. We make our own law, Ayana said firmly. Here, on this ranch, we decide what is right. As the fire burned low, Samuel realized they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They were choosing love over convention, family over law, their own truth over what society expected. It would not be easy. The world would not understand or accept their choice. But looking at the three remarkable women who had given him back his hope for the future, Samuel knew it was worth any price they might have to pay. Love, he learned that night, was not always simple or convenient. But when it was real, it was worth fighting for, no matter how impossible it seemed. November brought an early frost and Major Harrison's cavalry unit to Samuel's ranch. 24 blue-uniformed soldiers rode up to the house in perfect formation, their horses' breath steaming in the cold morning air. Samuel had been expecting this visit for months, but it still made his stomach clench with fear. Major Harrison was a tall, stern man with graying whiskers and the bearing of someone who had spent years enforcing unpopular orders. He dismounted and approached the porch where Samuel waited, trying to look calmer than he felt. Mr. Mitchell, the major said formally. I'm Major Harrison, Fort Apache. I believe you know why I'm here. Samuel nodded. The Apache women. Indeed. We've received reports that you're harboring 3 Apache fugitives on your property. These women should have reported to the San Carlos reservation months ago. They're not fugitives, Samuel said carefully. They're my employees. They help with ranch work. Major Harrison's expression remained skeptical. Employees? That's an interesting way to describe the situation. May I see these employees? Samuel had no choice but to call the sisters from the barn. They emerged together, walking with the dignity that had marked them from the first day Samuel met them. Even facing 24 armed soldiers, they showed no fear. The major studied them with professional interest. Quite tall for Apache women, he observed. Do you have names? Chenoa stepped forward slightly. I am Chenoa. These are my sisters, Ayana and Kimimela. You speak English well. Mission school? Yes. Major Harrison made notes in a small book. Are you daughters of Chief Nalnish? Samuel felt his heart skip. If the major knew about their father, this situation was even more dangerous than he had thought. We have no father, Ayana said coldly in her accented English. No tribe. We work here now. The major looked unconvinced. Miss, I have orders to escort all Apache peoples to the reservation. The government has established San Carlos for your protection and the protection of white settlers. Protection? Kimimela laughed bitterly. Protection from what? From working? From living free? Major Harrison's expression hardened. Young lady, the reservation system is United States law. I don't make policy, I enforce it. Samuel stepped forward. Major, these women pose no threat to anyone. They've helped me build this ranch into something productive. They're contributing members of the community. Community? The major looked around at the isolated ranch. What community, Mr. Mitchell? You live alone out here with 3 Apache women. Some might find that arrangement questionable. Samuel felt his face burn. There's nothing questionable about honest work and mutual respect. Perhaps. But I have my orders. Major Harrison closed his notebook. These women must come with me to San Carlos. They'll be processed and assigned housing at the reservation. No. The word came out of Samuel's mouth before he could stop it. The major raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? I said no. They're not going. Mr. Mitchell, you're interfering with federal law. I could arrest you for harboring fugitives. Samuel's heart pounded, but he held his ground. Then arrest me. The sisters moved closer to Samuel, presenting a united front against the cavalry. Ayanna's hand rested near her knife, and Samuel knew she would fight rather than be taken. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. Major Harrison studied them all for a long moment. There might be another way, he said finally. Are any of these women married? Samuel frowned. What does that have to do with anything? Married women take their husband's status. If one of them were legally married to a white citizen, she would have protection under territorial law. Samuel's mind raced. He remembered the secret ceremony he and Ayanna had performed weeks earlier, using vows from a book in his house. It hadn't been legal, but maybe. Actually, Samuel said slowly, Ayanna is my wife. The major looked surprised. You're married to her? Yes. Can you prove it? Samuel felt sweat break out on his forehead. We were married by Reverend Williams when he passed through. He took the certificate with him to file with the territorial government. It was a desperate lie, but Major Harrison seemed to consider it. That would protect one of them. What about the other two? Samuel looked at Chenoa and Kimimela, seeing the fear they were trying to hide. Their family, Ayanna's sisters. Surely that provides some protection. Not under current regulations. Unmarried Apache women must report to the reservation. The major paused. Unless they're also married to white citizens. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Samuel could marry all three sisters if he could find a way to make it legal, or at least make it look legal. I need time to think about this, Samuel said. Major Harrison shook his head. I'm afraid time is something we don't have. My orders are to complete this roundup before winter sets in fully. He gestured to his soldiers. We'll make camp by the creek tonight. Tomorrow morning, any unmarried Apache women on this property will be escorted to San Carlos. After the soldiers made their camp, Samuel and the sisters gathered in the kitchen to discuss their options. The situation seemed hopeless. Even if Samuel could somehow arrange marriages for Chenoa and Kimimela, there was no preacher available and no time to make them legal. We could run, Kimimela suggested. Head for Mexico tonight. Ayanna shook her head. Too many soldiers. Too much open ground. They would catch us. Then we fight, Ayanna said grimly. 24 soldiers? Samuel shook his head. That's suicide. Chenoa had been silent during the discussion. Now she spoke quietly. There might be another way. They all looked at her expectantly. The major said married women have protection. He didn't say the marriages had to be recent. Samuel frowned. What do you mean? I mean we perform Apache marriage ceremonies tonight. In our culture, witnesses make a marriage valid. Then we claim the marriages happened months ago before the major arrived. Would that work? Samuel asked. Chenoa shrugged. Apache law is still law, even if white men don't recognize it. And the major seemed more interested in following his orders than understanding our customs. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only chance they had. That night, by firelight in the barn, Chenoa performed traditional Apache marriage ceremonies binding Samuel to herself and to Kimimela. The rituals were simple but profound, involving promises of mutual protection and shared responsibility. Samuel felt the weight of what they were doing. These weren't marriages of convenience or legal fiction. They were real commitments between people who cared deeply for each other, even if the circumstances were impossible. When morning came, Major Harrison listened to their claims with obvious skepticism, but couldn't prove they were lying. The Apache ceremonies had been witnessed, and the sisters insisted they were valid marriages in their culture. This is highly irregular, the major said finally. But not illegal, Samuel replied. Major Harrison studied them all one more time, then made his decision. Very well. But I'll be checking on this situation, Mr. Mitchell. If I find any evidence that you're deceiving federal authorities, the consequences will be severe. As the cavalry rode away, Samuel and the three sisters stood on the porch watching them disappear into the desert. They had won this battle, but Samuel knew the war was far from over. What happens now? Kimimela asked. Samuel looked at the three remarkable women who were now, in some strange way, all his wives. Now we figure out how to make this impossible situation work. It wouldn't be easy. Society would never fully accept their unconventional family. The law would always be a threat hanging over them. But as Samuel felt the warmth of their presence beside him, he knew they would face whatever came next together. The cavalry had given them an ultimatum, but love had found a way to answer it. December brought bitter cold and unexpected trouble when Major Harrison returned with twice as many soldiers and a federal marshal. Samuel watched from his kitchen window as 48 uniformed men surrounded his ranch buildings, their breath steaming in the frigid air. The marshal was a thin, sharp-faced man named Thomas Crawford who wore his authority like a weapon. He dismounted at Samuel's porch with papers in his hand and suspicion in his eyes. "Samuel Mitchell," the marshal announced formally, "you're under investigation for violation of federal Indian policy and potential fraud regarding marriages to Apache women." Samuel's heart sank. Someone had reported their situation to higher authorities, and now they faced far more serious consequences than a simple relocation order. "Marshal Crawford," Major Harrison said, stepping forward, "these are the 3 Apache women in question. Mr. Mitchell claims to be married to all of them under Apache law." Marshal Crawford studied the sisters with obvious disdain. "Apache law has no standing in United States territory. These women are either legally married to Mr. Mitchell under territorial law, or they're unmarried Apache who should be on the reservation." Samuel felt the trap closing around them. "We followed Apache customs, which should be respected." "Mr. Mitchell," the marshal said coldly, "polygamy is illegal in all United States territories. If you claim to be married to multiple women, you're confessing to a federal crime." The sisters stood close together, their faces calm despite the danger. Samuel realized they had prepared for this moment, accepting that their impossible situation might finally collapse. "However," the marshal continued, "if you admit that only one of these marriages is valid, and surrender the other 2 women for relocation, we might be willing to overlook the irregularities." Samuel felt sick. They were being forced to choose which sister would be abandoned to save the others. "We won't be separated," Ayanna said firmly in English that had improved dramatically over the months. "Young lady, you don't have a choice in this matter," Marshal Crawford replied. "Actually, she does," said a voice from behind the soldiers. Everyone turned to see a well-dressed man approaching on horseback. He was elderly but carried himself with quiet authority, and his clothes marked him as someone important from back east. "And who might you be?" Marshal Crawford demanded. "James Morrison, reporter for the Denver Post," the man said, dismounting near the porch. "I've been following this story for weeks. Quite fascinating, really. The Apache chief's daughters who married a white rancher to avoid the reservation." Samuel felt a jolt of fear. A newspaper reporter was the last thing they needed. Morrison pulled out a notebook and pencil. "Marshal, I'd love to get your quote about why the federal government is so interested in breaking up a peaceful, productive family." "This is not a matter for the press," the marshal said sharply. "Oh, but it is," Morrison replied cheerfully. "The American people are very interested in how we treat Native peoples, especially when it involves brave women who've integrated successfully into white society." The reporter turned to Samuel. "Mr. Mitchell, is it true that these 3 Apache women saved your ranch during the Great Flood last August?" Samuel glanced at the marshal, then decided to take the risk. "Yes, without their help I would have lost everything." "And they've been contributing members of the community since then?" "Absolutely. They work harder than any men I've ever known." Morrison scribbled notes rapidly. "Fascinating. And Marshal Crawford, you're here to force these productive citizens onto a reservation where conditions are reportedly quite harsh?" The marshal's face reddened. "These women are subjects of federal Indian policy. Their personal circumstances are irrelevant." "Irrelevant?" Morrison's eyebrows rose. "So the government's position is that successful integration into American society should be punished?" Samuel could see the marshal struggling with the unexpected scrutiny. Bad publicity was apparently the last thing federal authorities wanted. Morrison turned to the sisters. "Ladies, would you like to comment on your situation?" Chenoa stepped forward, her dignity unshakable despite the circumstances. "We chose to build new lives here. We work, we contribute, we harm no one. Why should we be punished for success? The reservation is for your own protection," Major Harrison interjected. "Protection from what?" Kimimela asked. "From being useful? From being happy?" Morrison wrote down every word. Samuel realized the reporter was deliberately making this confrontation public, forcing the authorities to defend their actions in print. "Marshal," Morrison said, "I understand Chief Nalnish himself arranged these marriages. Wouldn't breaking them up constitute interference with Apache religious and cultural practices?" The marshal looked uncomfortable. "Chief Nalnish is a wanted fugitive, but not convicted of any crime according to my sources. And certainly his cultural authority over his own daughters remains valid." Samuel felt a glimmer of hope. The reporter was turning their desperate situation into a public relations nightmare for the federal government. Then Morrison dropped his biggest surprise. "Actually, Marshal, I should mention that I've been corresponding with several church groups back east who are very interested in this case. They see it as an example of successful Christian conversion and integration. Quite a few influential people are watching to see how this situation is resolved." Samuel stared at the reporter. Morrison was implying that powerful allies were monitoring their situation, allies who might cause serious problems for officials who handled this case badly. Marshal Crawford looked frustrated and uncertain. This was clearly not the simple enforcement action he had expected. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, "I've documented how these women have become respected members of their community. Local ranchers have testified to their character and contributions. Breaking up this family would be seen as government persecution of law-abiding citizens." Samuel realized that Morrison must have spent weeks researching their situation and building public support. Somehow their impossible love story had become a symbol of something larger. The standoff continued for 2 tense hours. The soldiers remained in position around the ranch, but the marshal seemed increasingly reluctant to act, while a reporter documented everything. Finally, Marshal Crawford made his decision. "Mr. Mitchell, you have 30 days to provide legal documentation that at least one of these marriages is valid under territorial law. If you cannot, all 3 women will be relocated to San Carlos." It was a compromise that gave them time but solved nothing. After the soldiers and marshal departed, Morrison stayed behind to explain his involvement. "Your story reached Denver through various sources," he said. "Church groups, Indian rights advocates, even some military officers who thought the policy was wrong-headed. People are interested in alternatives to the reservation system." Samuel felt overwhelmed. "What happens now?" "Now you become symbols," Morrison said bluntly. "Your success or failure will influence how the government treats other Apache families." No pressure. That evening, as Samuel and the sisters discussed their options, they realized their private struggle had become a public cause. The attention might protect them, but it also meant they could never again live quietly. 30 days, Chenoa said thoughtfully. "Can we make one marriage legal in that time?" Samuel nodded. "Probably. But that still leaves 2 of you vulnerable." "Then we find another way," Ayanna said firmly. "We've survived everything else." Looking at the 3 remarkable women who had become his family, Samuel felt a familiar determination rise in his chest. They had 30 days to find a legal solution to an impossible situation, but they had also discovered something valuable. They were not alone. Somewhere in the wider world, people believed their love story was worth fighting for. That would have to be enough to sustain them through whatever came next. 5 years had passed since that terrible December confrontation, and spring of 1892 found Samuel Mitchell's ranch transformed into something nobody could have imagined. What had started as an impossible command from an Apache chief had grown into a thriving community that defied every convention of the American frontier. Samuel stood on his expanded porch, watching his wife Ayanna work with a magnificent black stallion in the training corral. At 40 years old, he was still strong and weathered, but contentment had softened the harsh lines that loneliness had carved in his face. Ayanna had become the most respected horse trainer in the territory, sought out by ranchers and cavalry officers alike, who had heard of her almost magical ability to communicate with difficult animals. The legal solution to their impossible situation had come from an unexpected source. A territorial judge named William Hayes, influenced by the newspaper coverage and pressure from Eastern church groups, had ruled that Apache marriage customs deserved recognition under territorial law. Samuel's marriage to Ayanna became officially legal, while his relationships with Chenoa and Kimimela were recognized as domestic partnerships with limited legal protection. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The 3 sisters remained together. Samuel remained their partner and protector, and the federal government found other battles to fight. Chenoa emerged from the new medical building Samuel had constructed for her practice. Over the years, she had become the unofficial doctor for a 20-mile radius, treating everyone from Apache families still living free in the mountains to white settlers who initially came to her in desperation, but stayed out of respect for her skills. Her knowledge of both traditional Apache healing and modern medical techniques made her invaluable to the scattered frontier community. "Mrs. Patterson's baby will be fine," Chenoa told Samuel as she approached the porch. "Just a fever from teething." Samuel smiled at how naturally Mrs. Patterson came to her lips. 5 years ago, white families would never have trusted an Apache woman with their children. Now they traveled for days to seek Chenoa's help. Kimimela rode up from the south pasture, her horse lathered from hard riding. At 23, she had grown into a formidable woman, whose skill as a trader and negotiator made her essential to the ranch's prosperity. She had established trade relationships with Apache bands, Mexican ranchers, and white settlements throughout the region, serving as a bridge between worlds that had once seemed impossibly separate. "The Murphy brothers want to buy 20 head, she announced, swinging down from her horse with fluid grace. "They're offering top dollar for horses trained by Ayanna." Samuel nodded with satisfaction. The ranch now focused primarily on horses rather than cattle, a change suggested by the sisters that had proved brilliantly successful. Their reputation for producing intelligent, well-trained animals had spread throughout the Southwest. As evening approached, the extended family gathered on the porch as they did every day. This ritual had become the heart of their unusual household, a time for sharing news, discussing problems, and simply enjoying each other's company. Chief Nalnish emerged from the main house, moving slowly but with dignity despite his 70-plus years. The old warrior had arrived 2 years earlier, finally too old and tired to continue his long resistance against the reservation system. Samuel had welcomed him without question, and the chief had gradually become the wise elder their unconventional family had needed. "The baby grows strong," the chief said in his careful English, referring to Samuel and Ayanna's 6-month-old son sleeping in the house behind them. Samuel felt his chest swell with pride every time he thought about little Joseph, whose dark hair and bright eyes promised to combine the best features of both his parents. The boy represented something entirely new, a bridge between Apache and white worlds that had never existed before. "He has his mother's wisdom and his father's stubbornness," Chenoa said with a smile. "All babies are stubborn," Kimimela added. "That's how they survive." The chief looked at his daughters with obvious satisfaction. "You have chosen well," he said to Samuel. "This is not the future I commanded, but it is better than what I commanded." Samuel understood what the old man meant. The chief's original decree had been born of desperation, a father's attempt to ensure his daughter's survival in a hostile world. What had actually developed was something far richer, a family built on genuine love, mutual respect, and shared purpose. As darkness fell and the desert stars appeared, Samuel reflected on the strange journey that had brought them all together. The outside world still struggled to understand their arrangement. Some church groups celebrated them as an example of successful cultural integration. Others condemned them as violations of Christian marriage. Government officials remained officially disapproving, but found it difficult to argue with their obvious success and community acceptance. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked Ayanna as they prepared for bed later that evening. "The way things worked out, I mean." Ayanna looked at him with surprise. "Regret love? Regret family? Regret building something good from nothing?" She shook her head. "The only thing I regret is that it took so long to understand what my father really commanded." "What do you mean?" "He didn't command you to marry us," Ayanna said thoughtfully. "He commanded you to care for us, to protect us, to give us a place in the world. Marriage was just the word he used because it was the only word he knew." Samuel considered this as he held his sleeping son. Perhaps the chief had been wiser than any of them realized. By giving them an impossible command, he had forced them to create their own definition of family, love, and commitment. The next morning brought visitors, a delegation of Apache women, from the San Carlos reservation who had come to see for themselves the legendary chiefs, daughters who had escaped the white man's cages. Samuel watched from a distance as the sisters shared a meal with their visitors, speaking in rapid Apache and comparing their different paths to survival. Later, Chenoa translated some of the conversation. "They asked if we were happy," she said. "I told them happiness was too simple a word. We are useful. We are valued. We choose our own lives. That is better than happiness. Samuel understood exactly what she meant. Their life wasn't simple or conventional, but it was theirs. They had taken an impossible situation and shaped it into something that worked, something that contributed to the world around them. As 1892 progressed, their story continued to spread. More reporters came to document their unusual success. Government officials studied their arrangement as a possible model for Apache integration. Church groups debated whether their family structure was Christian or heathen. But for Samuel and the three sisters, the outside attention mattered less than the daily reality of their shared life. They had discovered that love could take forms that no law or custom had anticipated, and that family could be built from the most unlikely materials. Standing on his porch one evening as summer faded toward autumn, Samuel watched Ayana teaching their son to clap his hands while Chinoa and Kimimela argued good-naturedly about trade routes, and Chief Nalnish dozed in his chair. This was his legacy, not the ranch or the horses or the money, but this impossible family that had grown from a desperate father's command and an unlikely white man's loneliness. The Apache chief had been right about one thing. His daughters had brought Samuel strength, wisdom, and children. They had built something great together, something that transcended the boundaries of race, law, and convention. But most importantly, they had proved that love, when it was real and when people were willing to fight for it, could overcome anything, even the impossible.